Welcome to today's Holocaust Living History workshop, and thank you for joining us. I would like to begin by thanking the sponsors of today's event, Nancy and Joel Dimsdale. Nancy and Joel have been staunch supporters of the Holocaust Living History workshop through the years, and Joel himself has presented his fascinating work on the Nuremberg trial to a workshop audience in the past. I am particularly grateful to Nancy for bringing today's film to our attention. This event literally would not have taken place without you, so thank you. I also wish to acknowledge the UC San Diego Library and the Jewish Studies program for their continued support of the Holocaust Living History workshop. And now it is my pleasure to present the program. The screening, which will take 38 minutes, will be followed by a conversation between Father Ron Schmidt and Professor Michael Berenbaum. So please stay on after the screening. And now it is time for the film. What a unique and haunting film. I have to admit, I've never quite seen the like. And now to our long-awaited guests. Father Ron Schmidt is a Catholic priest and award-winning international documentary filmmaker whose films include, obviously, The Labyrinth, an internationally award-winning documentary that has been in 21 film festivals and won 10 awards. Franz Jägerstätter, A Man of Conscience, a short documentary that won the Redemptive Storytelling Award. In Spite of Darkness, a film on the annual non-denominational Auschwitz retreat, as well as numerous other documentaries. Two of his films were awarded Silver Tellys for Best in their categories, and all three films have secured international distribution. Father Schmidt gives film seminars and film retreats, and along with his son Jason, has partnered in developing and producing documentaries. Film seems to run in the bloodstream of the Schmidts. Ron's father is the distinguished film editor Arthur P. Schmidt, best known for editing such classic films as Sunset Boulevard, Some Like It Hot, Sabrina, and Sayonara. His brother Arthur is an Academy Award-winning film editor who has won awards for Forrest Gump and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Another son, Matthew, is a film editor who recently edited Avengers, Endgame, and other Marvel films. Our second guest is equally illustrious. Michael Berenbaum is the director of the Ziggy Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University. The author and editor of 20 books, he was also the executive editor of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He was project director overseeing the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the first director of its research institute, and later served as president and CEO of the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. As some of you know, the UC San Diego Library is one of the very few institutions on the West Coast to offer access to the entire database of the Shoah Foundation. Dr. Berenbaum is also the author and editor of 18 books, scores of scholarly articles, and hundreds of journalistic pieces. He won the Simon Rockhauer Memorial Award of the American Jewish Press Association 3 times in 3 different categories during a 2-year period. We are very honored to host both of you today. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Let me begin, because I'm going to ask Father Schmidt a number of questions, but let me begin with a very simple thing. He and I are longtime friends. I think we're virtually brothers, and it would be preposterous for me to refer to him as Father, since I know him very well as Ron. I think we're a model of interreligious understanding that's made possible in the climate of tolerance and pluralism in the United States. So, Ron, let me ask you the very basic question. How did you come across this material, and what made you start and do this film?
Well, I second our friendship, Michael. It's been a true blessing, and I count you as a friend, a colleague, and a mentor. I came across this when we were making another film in Auschwitz. It was mentioned in Suzanne's introduction It was a interreligious retreat at Auschwitz started by American Zen master Bernie Glassman. And we were making that film with a fellow Jesuit, Christoph Wolff, when we went to the Labyrinth, which is in the basement of a church about 6 kilometers away from Auschwitz. Part of the retreat took us there. And as we walked through the exhibit, the Labyrinth, I sat down with Marian and I asked him, and I said, Marian, has anybody ever done a documentary, about you? And he turned to me, and of course, this is all through translation. And he kind of said with a smile, well, yes, about 9 or 10. And then I said, will anybody make a documentary in English, an English documentary or American? And he said no. And when we got back to the States and my son Jason was editing the film, the Auschwitz retreat film, saw the footage of the Labyrinth, he turned to me and he said, Dad, this is the film that we need to make. And that's when we decided to make the Labyrinth. And I'm going to let Michael tell you how I have a son, because he likes to tell this story.
I love to tell the story because Father Schmidt was married and his beloved wife died. And it's only then that he decided in his 50s to join the priesthood and become indeed at that point part of the Society of Jesuits. So as I say, and he does not say, it's probably much easier to choose to be celibate in your 50s and 60s to teenage years. And I think virtually all the college students listening would tend to agree with that. This is really, I'm struck every time I see it, that this is really a spiritual document. And part of what makes it work is the combination of the 3 elements that make film work, which is the visual, the audio, and then the musical. And how did you commission the musician to write the score and then to integrate it? Because it gives it breathing room, and the photography is magnificent, and the testimony is authentic and original. And I can't stress for our listeners enough, for our students enough, that this is prisoner number 432. And he says at the very beginning, I know Auschwitz, I built Auschwitz. And he's not kidding about that. He was there in 1940. But tell us about the integration of music and art and testimony.
I'll be sure, thank you. Well, addressing the music, and I don't remember how I discovered this, but obviously we needed composed music. And somebody mentioned to me here in LA that there was a composer of Polish music who ran the Polish Center at the University of Southern California. His name is Marek Zabrowski. And I met him. We talked about the film. He saw part of the film, but wasn't completed. And we gave him information about at least the sections of the film that we were doing, whether it was the bowls or the Tree of Life. We told him about that, and he composed that music. Then my son Jason integrated the music in. So the composer didn't sing the completed film, which is normally the way you do it. My son Jason integrated the music into the film. As to the testimony of Marian, there were 3 sources for that. Marian had published a book of his drawings, and he had a fairly lengthy introduction in German and Polish and English about his experience, where he does use that phrase, I built Auschwitz. And so we used that. We also interviewed Marian, so we used the transcriptions of our interviews on camera. And then he had also given his testimony to the Auschwitz Museum and on the grounds of Auschwitz. And you're very familiar with that, Michael. The museum there So his testimony was on file, and we got a translation in English and then integrated all those three elements into his testimony that you hear spoken by another Polish friend, Roman Charny. So that's...
Now, we've been asked, Ron, how large are the original drawings? You and I have both been there, and
right. The original drawings, I don't know how to describe it, but picture a drawing table on your lap, because he did a lot of those. That's how he did it. So maybe 2 by 3 pieces of paper, and he would draw, and then he had to match them. He had to match them up, and you can see the lines. There are a couple of places where you can see thumbtacks where he put them together. I would say the largest is probably, I think, the opening sequence where you see him, we pan to him where he finally says, "And I started to draw." That's probably about 12 feet long. And then the height of the building, maybe 10 feet high from top to bottom. But he had to piece all those together in little pieces of drawing paper.
But I want everybody to understand that this was in him for many, many, many years. And part of his self-healing process was to bring it out in the world. So what we have here is a testimony in art coupled with a testimony in words. And what you've done is to integrate that into one of the most spiritually moving and awesome films. And what I appreciate as a rabbi is how deeply he understood the difference between the diversity of Auschwitz and the experience. And we've been asked about, a priest is mentioned, were there many Christians in Auschwitz? So let me answer that Auschwitz was actually 3 camps with the same name. They're called, for very simple purposes, they're called Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, Auschwitz III. Auschwitz I was a Polish concentration camp for political prisoners and others that had many Christians and, in fact, several priests. And the greatest of them was clearly what you heard, Marian Kolodziej, who gave up his life for a man he did not know. Auschwitz II, which is Birkenau, was the killing center, the death camp, in which about 1.1 million people were killed, 9 out of 10 of them Jews, and the other group that was large was the Roman Sinti, who were called gypsies. And Auschwitz III was an entire industrial complex of 50 subcamps in which German industry invested 700 million Reichsmarks in 1942 alone. So you have to get the scale of it. And today even, you don't visit Auschwitz III because Auschwitz III is the industrial complex of Upper Silesia, because the infrastructure that was built is still being used. Now, one of our listeners said, you made a film in the language, universal language of humanity, and painful to think about the pettiness and endless indignity we witness in the day in, day out. The number 432 will become a mantra for me. Let's ask, how has this film influenced you, Ron?
You know, it just has influenced me in terms of sensitivity to issues of injustice. I tell the story, and I want to say privilege, okay? We'll use that word, but I tell the story that one of the most profound moments when I was at the camp doing the filming, and we were on the Auschwitz retreat, not doing this filming, but prior to this, I was walking the grounds of Auschwitz II, Birkenau, and I remember where exactly I was. I was in front of the stables that they turned into housing to house the inmates. Stacks of bunks, 3 or 4 high. And I was standing outside, and it was cold. And I remember saying to myself, boy, I was wrapped in a jacket. I had gloves, I had a hat. And I said, wow, I'm cold. And then a moment came to me and I said, how can you say that? These people were here at this time, the same times of year and colder, in pajamas, essentially. And there was a moment of awareness that said, wow, you really aren't cold. You've never been as cold as they were or suffered as much as they did. So there was an awakening of the suffering that went on, the inhumanity that existed. How could that exist? How could that happen? So it has influenced me in many ways, more sensitive to the suffering that exists in the world. And I'm, and we see it today in the war in Ukraine. So yes, that's
the other thing that I think we should appreciate is, and you just said it, we use the word cold and we had a good meal. We have a jacket. We have a warm car waiting for us and know that we'll be sleeping in a warm bed. They got cold in October, they got warm again in May. And they got the type of cold that every moment of that shook your body to its absolute core. We've been asked, did Marian indicate what precipitated his decision to begin drawing so many years later after his, other than his recovery from the stroke? I think we should say that the drawing was his recovery from the stroke.
I think what he did was to suppress the memory and got on with of the camps and got on with his life as a set designer and film designer and living his life. But at the moment of the stroke probably brought back the promise, and he says so, the promise he made that to the inmates at the time, that don't let us forget, don't forget us. And so that's what started his drawing. Now, he had done some drawings in the camp, a few there, and those have been found and are in the exhibit. But I think it was the recovery, not only the physical recovery, but the stroke was very serious and brought him close to death. And he said there's not much time left, although he did have about almost 16 years subsequent to that to do the drawings. But I think he realized that, he verged on death and he had to get it out.
I believe that the drawing was his way of essentially both investing in the future and reconciling in a certain particular way with the past.
Yes, yeah. And
that's enormously powerful. The other thing about it is it's an outpouring. I mean, it's if you some of our students here will be psychologists. This is the return of the repressed with a vengeance.
Yes, and I will say that when I talked to his wife, she told us, he'd do a drawing, he'd do a set of drawings and they'd go install them. He and his wife would go and install them in the exhibit. I don't think they had any help. And he'd say, well, I'm done. I've done enough. And his wife would just kind of look at him and they'd get back to their apartment and then he'd start drawing again. He never ended until he had a second major stroke that led to his death. But he kept drawing until he died.
When he had 16 years afterwards.
Yes, yeah.
Which may tell you something about what it means to invest in the future and to bear witness and the power of that. He was a deeply religious man.
He was. I think he struggled with that, with the evil that he experienced. And as we know, the question, where was God in all this? But he was a very religious man, yeah. But he did struggle with the question of evil and where was God in this during this time.
I think that takes anybody who's religious has to wrestle with that question.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, it's the question that brought me to first really explore the Holocaust. We've been asked, how has his testimony been received in Poland?
Well, he was highly revered in Poland, as both as an artist and a set designer and as a survivor of Auschwitz. And then he had a couple of exhibits in Gdańsk and maybe in Warsaw before the permanent exhibit space was given to him, I think late in the 90s, mid-1990s, early 2000. But yes, he was highly revered for his testimony. We have to remember one thing, that from the time he was liberated until 1989, when the wall fell, he was under communist rule. So they didn't want him to speak very much. So it was until after 1989 that the history of the camps started to come out in Poland. So you have more information on that.
The true story could be told. Did he and his wife have children?
No. Well, I think he was married prior to his second wife. So we did have, yes, there is a child that I'm aware of, yes. I have not made it never came up in our conversations. Let me put it that way.
Let me say one thing about how he's received in Poland. Anybody who knows anything about Auschwitz has reverence for what they call the low numbers. The low numbers means that you have endured multiple winters, and you've endured that cold, you've endured that hunger, and you have somehow been able to get through it. And veteran prisoners were regarded with deep and profound respect by those at Auschwitz. I'm going to turn this back now to Susan, and I'm going to apologize and get off, but my plane leaves in 27 minutes.
Oh, okay.
I've been forced to be here because of family situation. So I apologize, Ron. You and I can go on like this for hours, but let me turn it back to Suzanne, and we'll continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I'm sorry you have to leave, but obviously we don't want you to miss the plane. You would have to feel guilty. So I have two kind of broad questions for you, Ron. The first one has to do with a topic that has already been touched on, the healing power of art. I'm wondering, what is your view? In the post-war period, numerous survivors, they wrote down their testimonies. I mean, they wrote a memoir. They wanted to preserve their memories. And then throughout the decades, some survivors, they participated in war crimes trials. They gave their legal testimony. And then later, still, people gave their oral testimony. And my question is, how healing is this outpouring of painful memories? Because it occurred to me, watching the absolutely unique work of Marian Kolodziej. Yes, it must have been painful to confront these horrifying memories. So what's the balance between healing and a painful confrontation in your view?
Well, that's a tough question, but let me answer it in specifics as I understood it for him. As he said, he could never get away from Auschwitz. It was, as he said, in everything he did. And if you look at some of his set designs because he was a well-known and famous set designer for plays. And frequently you can see images of horror in his set designs. So I think, and he frequently, well, when we first met him, he said, "Oh, I don't believe that, my drawings help my healing." And that's what he said. Later on, maybe a year or two later, when we went back, he kind of agreed that there was a healing to it. But I think the balance, I mean, he could never get over the post-traumatic stress of the events. But it gave him energy, obviously, for 16 years. It gave him a great artistic, creative energy to do this. And he had a wonderful relationship with his wife, Helena. There's one image I have of them. Now they're in there. At the time we were doing that, they were both she may have been late 60s, early 70s. We were in a museum. We were looking at some of his set designs, as well as set designer did costumes, and he did costumes for her, for plays. And he'd hold up this costume and say, "Remember when you wore this for Macbeth or whatever?" And she'd laugh. And at one point they're looking at this, and we turned to them, and she was sitting in his lap. And it was a moment of great, of course, it was a moment of great love and continuity. So that gave him, I think, a great deal of healing. But I think the artwork, I know that when we were there filming, and we were there for about 8 days in the Labyrinth, doing a lot of filming, and he was there with his wife. One morning she came down to breakfast and said, "No, he's not coming down. He's having memories. He had a bad night. He had nightmares, Holocaust nightmares." So that's, excuse me, the dog just reacted to something. So that was a big deal. But I think there was healing in there, ultimately. But I don't think he felt that initially. Let me put it that way.
It is interesting because you almost made it sound as if it's this energy that kept him going, that kept him alive after the stroke.
Oh, I think it did.
Yeah, the purpose. Yes,
he'd have these moments and say, "Oh, I've got to tell this. I've got to put this to pen to paper. I've got to remember this," whether it's the orchestra or the bowls or the last part of it where he talked about the scales and binding the scales. Yeah.
I'll have a question about that. But before, I would like to ask, somebody is wondering, do you see this film as an educational tool for teenagers?
Yes, I do think it is an educational for teachers. I've had it for 8th graders. I've shown it for 8th graders in 1 or 2 schools, not a lot. Certainly at college level, it's been shown. Yeah. So I do think it's educational because it's the visuals you get to see. You really get the experience, and it becomes an educational, spiritual experience, I think, and by that I mean getting the horrors. Yeah. Right.
What struck me really was the power of the silences. I don't know if this was part of the score or if it was your son's work putting it together, but there were moments when, kind of long moments, where no music was playing. And I just thought these were the screams that weren't heard.
Yes, and that was very intentional. But on his part, he said he wanted that silence just for that very reason, because you were forced to be silent. When you go through the labyrinth, it's silent. As you're looking at the drawings, maybe somebody's explaining something if you have somebody taking you through it, but it forces you to silence.
Is this open to the public?
It is open to the public. The problem is it's not like open 9 to 5. So you have to make arrangements with the Franciscan monks who run a monastery and a retreat house. So you have to make arrangements to get it open, which is very challenging.
Oh, okay. My final, oh, go ahead.
Well, Michael Berenbaum has gone much more often than I have, number of times. So he manages to get it arranged for any tour group or any group, not tour, but any group he's taking over to Auschwitz. Yeah.
That is good to know. My final question deals with this striking phrase, mind the scales. And I was thinking yesterday, I just finished teaching a semester-long course on the history of the Holocaust. And I know for many students, taking this class is difficult because they are confronted with this history of such relentless evil and brutality. And it struck me that the mind the scales phrase, it can be understood as a warning, mind the scales, but also there's a possibility there. It is in our power to mind the scale and to go either the good way or...
Exactly.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yes, I think you're right. That's what and I will tell you where that came from too. Well, one was the weighing of the bread rations that they got a pittance of at the end of the, as everybody took their rations ahead of them. But he was very conscious that there was one time they had a roll call when a prisoner was missing. And so when they made the inmates march all day around the grounds this was Auschwitz I. And if anybody fell, nobody could help them. So he always felt guilty that he might have stepped on somebody and injured them or worse. So he felt that, and I just was reading again his reflections on that. So he was very conscious of the good and bad and how that played out. So he was very conscious that he said, mind the scales, weigh what you're doing, because you don't know, don't just go off half-cocked kind of thing. Weigh what you're doing, weigh the good, the right, the values that you have. I think that's what he was saying, and he mind the scales. It's very interesting. I want to just mention this. When we first made the film, I was very aware that I'm not Jewish and I'm making a story about the Holocaust. And I said to my son, I said, before we finish anything, we're going to have the experts review this film. Now, at that time, I didn't know Michael Berenbaum, but I knew people at the Museum of Tolerance. So I went to the Museum of Tolerance here and screened it for two of the prominent rabbis there. And they gave their blessing. But one was struck by mind the scales. He said, I'm very struck by that phrase, mind the scales, just as you were. Very interesting.
I will certainly take that with me. Well, thank you so much, Ron, and thank you to Michael.
I'll pass that on.
For adding so much to our appreciation of this very unique film.
Thank you.
It has been a real pleasure spending time with you in cyberspace. I never thought I would hear myself say that.
Say that, exactly.
But here we are.
Me too. Thank you for inviting us.
Of course. Thank you again for attending, and good night.